Hi, this is Anna Imagination with the Healing Garden, and welcome to Shifting Perspectives. If you are new to my channel, I have 30 years in philosophy, psychology, sociology, and I'm talking about diagnosing your parenting. So I just sat down with a brief interview with a bunch of toddlers. It was wonderful. I adored it. It was so much fun. I was able to ask the toddlers some questions about what did it feel like being a baby, what emotions did you experience, what do you remember from being an infant. And the children were 3.5 years old and 21 months old. The 21-month-old could not articulate clearly enough to be understood. The 3.5-year-old could articulate things much better at most of the time. And the first emotion she came right out with was overwhelmed. She reported feeling an absolute feeling of overwhelm by being a baby. And then the second emotion she expressed was when we asked her what was it like to be 2 years old. She used the word, it felt free. It was it was extraordinary to hear her describe that being 2 years old, what felt like being free. And I confirmed the child was capable of using the th sound, so it was not a mispronunciation due to the lack of development or the onset development of the th sound. She was able to articulate the difference between free or three, and the child very clearly said free. That being said, we watched her behave with her brother. She's the older of the two. She's the 3.5-year-old. And we watched her for about 15 minutes to 30 minutes interact with her brother during play. We watched her try to take a toy that was not hers. And at one point, she was interacting with her brother, and she basically projected her own ability to, 3 years old. She projected her own ability to want to help over enabling behavior. And her brother said no. He set a boundary. 21 months old, and he set a very verbal boundary. Don't do that. She then gaslit him. 3.5 years old, and she gaslit him and said, but I'm just trying to help. Now, when you have a 3.5-year-old, that is mimic and repetition. That is nothing else but mommy and daddy taught her that, and she repeated it. There is no room for argument. It was extraordinary. On the spot, I broke it down and was talking to the babysitter at that time. And I explained that that is basically a mimic repetition of somebody using a boundary. And the boundary was violated. And she literally argued back, but I'm just trying to help, which translates to your boundary doesn't mean anything because my intention is good and therefore your boundary is invalid. She prioritized through mimicry and repetition only, not through logic or conscious awareness, just through mimicry and repetition. She prioritized her agenda and her wanting to be helpful more than his comfort level. She needed to be helpful. And I said, well, that is the early stages of narcissism. It was extraordinary to watch. She needed to be helpful at the expense of his comfort. Oh, this was so the expense of his comfort. She valued her need to be helpful more than, which means love already means being needed. She's already learned that lesson, 3.5 years old. And I can't explain enough how extraordinary this is to see that level of narcissism already embedded through mimicry and repetition at a 3-year-old. And because mimicry and repetition are so prevalent, you're now looking at a society or a household where She basically, there is a violation of boundaries. And when boundaries are expressed, they are dismissed and invalidated. And the babysitter explained that whenever she's dropped off at a daycare, she screams. She has significant attachment to the parent when she's dropped off at a daycare. That is already her attachment disorder coming out. She has insecure attachment style already at 3.5 years old. And the reason why is because they have no boundary setting, because her defense system at 3.5 years old is already taken away from her. At 3.5 years old, she has already lost her defense system. She already has developed insecure attachment disorder. She's already showing early signs of narcissism and an invalidation for other people's or a respect for other people's boundaries. And she's already prioritizing being helpful more than his comfort, in addition to the limiting belief that love equals being needed and therefore trumps everything else. This child has narcissistic parents and has already internalized the lessons of narcissism at 3.5 years old. Extraordinary. Extraordinary. And because she's only 3.5 years old, there's no logical concept. This is pure mimicry and repetition of one's behavior. And then I had a thought that if I were to step in and talk to the parents at this point and guide them through, your narcissism and your mental illness is already interfering with this child's security, attachment, all of it already. What if we were to step in when the child is only 3 years old and start correcting all of these behavioral problems in the parents, so that the parents provide a better example leadership, so that the child can mimic and repeat a healthy exchange of boundaries, a healthy defense system, a healthy definition of love? A lot of trauma could be prevented. So I am now offering parental diagnosis, basically and I want to say it's great for parents between the ages, or for children, for toddlers between the ages of 2 and 4 years old. That's really it right there. 2 and 4 years old, you can go and look at the child. And again, I'll say it, the children are 100% basic mimics and parrots. They're mimics and parrots at this age group. They do nothing but mimic and repeat what it is they see and experience all day long. It's extraordinary. So if you want to know what kind of a parent you are already shaping into be, there's nothing more honest and transparent than a 2 and a 4-year-old. The fact that the child also expressed that being 2, as opposed to being 3.5, being 2 felt like being free, which means already she doesn't feel like she's 3. At 3.5, she's already looking at losing her freedom, which is that conformity starting to step in. So it was extraordinary to see all of these little pieces just shift and move together. So, I also found, for me personally, I found a significant passion on working with toddlers, parents. Oh my God, do I love this. I absolutely adore working with parents and working with children. I love this stuff. So this is definitely something I'm going to be focusing far more on and going forward with it. The child's ability to articulate, this was interesting. When we asked her also what other emotions that she felt, she used the word specifically mommy and daddy, which is interesting because it's almost as if she was using those roles, those people, to supplant emotions. As if when we asked her, we asked her what the emotions were, and she said mommy and daddy. It's as if there was emotional memory before there was anything else. Before there was an individual, it was emotional memory. And when we talked to her about her emotions, she cited the parental roles. This is after she said overwhelm. So overwhelm trumps mommy and daddy. And the sitter saw this, and her response to it was, wow, that's a big word, which I interfered with the babysitter at that point. And I said, do not normalize it. Do not act surprised that the child is using a large word, overwhelm. It's actually not a large word. We think it is. So we exude surprise, shock, awe, and then we're like, wow, that's a big word. And in a child's brain, because children only think literally and concrete thinkers at that point, they don't understand abstract thought. They don't understand simile or metaphor. They take it all literally. So when they say shock and awe, they associate that with disapproval. And for their own survival instinct, they default to what's the approval rating of the parent or the caregiver. So they default to approval rating. So every time you show shock, awe, surprise because of your glass ceiling or your expectations that you've put on a child, your limitations that you have boxed a child into, the child then gets it in their mind through their concrete thinking that, oh, this is not approved of. I have to go back to the approval rating. And they will put themselves back in a box as a means to basically conform and make sure that they are approved of. And as a result, they won't grow. They won't continue to use large words. Technically, overwhelm is not a large word. We have very, very low expectations on children. We have a significant underwhelm of what a child can do. And because we keep putting this glass ceiling on our children, whenever our children exceed that glass ceiling, we're surprised. And that's something that has got to stop. Because every time we act surprised that they've exceeded our expectations, we are re-informing the children that they should not exceed our expectations. Shock and awe is a negative emotion. It is an absolute negative emotion. It is not something that comes off as being desired or positive. It is a trauma emotion because when you feel shock and awe and surprise, for the most part, this is why so many toddlers cry when you throw them a surprise party, is because shock and awe are disturbing emotions because it's jarring. So when a child experiences the emotions of shock and awe, they avert away from those because they're not pleasant emotions. And adults constantly put shock and awe on top of children with, wow, you exceeded my expectations, which is another way of saying, I expected so much less from you. And now the child is going to conform to your low expectations. So we think children are incapable of using large words. We think children are incapable of speaking. Now, here's something else that I noticed was really interesting. This really fascinated me. The child felt like her ability to articulate was less than her vocabulary. It felt like the words were in her head, the feelings were in her head, but she was limited by her tongue and her oral skills. That's what it felt like. It felt like she had access to a much larger vocabulary than she could use or access because her physical barrier, her tongue and oral skills, had not yet developed, allowing her to articulate it, which I can understand where now there's a lot of frustration there. And I can see where a lot of children have pent up frustration and overwhelm because they can't articulate what's inside of their head. I had this experience when I was at the 7th perspective and again at the 12th perspective at first, where there was so much inside of my head and I was limited by my physical barrier that I could not articulate what I needed to say. Very frustrating. The 7th perspective was horribly frustrating. So I'm seeing that again with toddlers where I'm looking at this 3.5-year-old going, she's got a lot more to say, but she's limited by her own command and articulation of the tongue, the lips, the mouth. There's a lot that goes on. When I studied linguistics and early child development, there's a lot that goes on here. There's your brain capacity, there's your ability to improv, there's ability to process, memorize words, and then there's the oral, basically the oral shape of the mouth, the ability to articulate each and every shape, in addition to your ability to basically evolve, develop language. And the part of your brain before you're 8 years old is hardwired to learn, absorb, and consume language skills, learning skills especially, so that by the time you're 8, the communication centers of the brain turn off. Interesting. So I did get the impression very solidly that this child had a lot more vocabulary inside of her mind than she was able to physically express due to the fact that she was 3.5 years old. So it was absolutely fascinating. So Yeah, it's definitely something I'm going to be offering now is basically a parental diagnosis. Get your parenting diagnosed when your children are between the ages of 2 and 4 years old, so you can catch all of the faulty parenting or problematic parenting that you are basically already subjecting your child to. But 2 and 4 years old is early enough that you can step in and correct it. Now, here's the two things. And this is something that I had follow up with the babysitter. She was asking me a lot of questions. I just released something called the pendulum paradigm. And I'm not going to get into the pendulum paradigm here, but the pendulum paradigm is a massive contributor to our parenting skills, as well as our own mimic and repetition behaviors. Now, our mimic and repetition is independent from the pendulum paradigm. But these two factors, the pendulum paradigm and the mimic repetition parenting, are 100%. This is the parenting cocktail that determines how well we parent. This is what I called absent-minded parenting. And I am going to go ahead and get into this a little bit here, what the pendulum paradigm is. The pendulum paradigm is basically, we've all heard of black and white thinking. We have all heard of, let me get my notes up here. Okay, so you've heard of scarcity mindset, and you've heard of black and white thinking or polarized thinking. We're all very familiar with prejudice, and we're all very familiar with hierarchical thinking, and we are all familiar with avoidant and anxious attachment styles. What you don't know, what a lot of people don't realize, is that these five things are absolutely linked and connected, all under pendulum paradigm. This is basically let me go ahead back over to my notes here. And it's basically a scarcity mindset that basically comes down to two things. Either you have suffered from pain from a surplus of negative experience or pain from a deficiency of positive. Those are your two options. And you can have an accumulation of both of those things. This is scarcity versus abundance, which leads to a programmed response of paying equals surplus of negative and or a paying equals deficiency of positive resources. So the subconscious mind resolves this imbalance with extreme unchecked response. Avoidance to prevent pain, hoarding to prevent deficiency. If you are an avoidant to prevent the pain from the negative, you're probably an empath. If you hoard to prevent deficiency, you're probably a narcissist. And the borderline personality sufferer does both. Now, these things are absolutely a direct link to the scarcity in our child's the scarcity mindset of not having enough. Nurturing resources. Physical resources are the most common. We hear about physical resources all the time. So when we think scarcity, resources, and hoarding, when we think abundance, we think money, clothes, sex, friends, food, shelter. Emotional resources, however, is love, celebration of you, acceptance, belonging. Nurturing resources is attention, affection, comfort, and support. Self resources is self value, self importance, self solutions, and problem solving. If you have a scarcity on any of these, you are going to experience the pendulum paradigm. The pendulum paradigm is a significant aversion to being invisible, a significant aversion to avoiding what caused you significant pain to begin with. And it is linked 100% to narcissism. It's absolutely the core of narcissism. It's the I'm going to swing the absolute other way. And it's extreme aversion or prejudice. Prejudice is the most extreme form of scarcity aversion. And that's it. It's a scarcity aversion. There is a line here that I wrote that was just spot on with precisely what it is. When our parents failed it, let me see here. It's like summarizing everything in a nutshell, but it's very much like a swinging pendulum. Most parents project either their own traumas and extreme aversion of polarized thinking onto the child's life, exposing the child to the opposite extreme aversion of polarized thinking. So, like a swinging pendulum, the child almost always grows up hoarding the extreme opposite of their childhood, as if extreme hoarding or abundance is an aversion response to extreme scarcity. What is this? There's a line I wrote in here and it was perfect. And I'm looking for it because it's really, really important and it's just spot on. When you hate is most likely what was used to abuse you. And when our parents failed to teach us how to self nurture, our subconscious mind uses extreme aversion instead to swing the opposite way, hence the pendulum paradigm. Because we do not trust ourselves to regulate the thing that harmed us, we do not trust ourselves to protect ourselves from the thing that harmed us. You need boundaries to do that. Oh, but wait, it's not safe to talk. Here it is. This hate, which is really fear in disguise, fills our lives with extreme aversions, which is an unchecked avoidant behavior disguised as personal preference or character traits. This is called denial, lies that our subconscious mind tells our conscious awareness, so we won't go problem solving, our avoidant behavior, which is doing a really good job protecting us. Or is it? Extreme aversion is the core mindset that results in competitive, argumentative, combative, hostile, hierarchy, high priority placed on status, or a high priority placed on status, alpha thinking, superiority, ageism, and racism. And all of this can be summarized with one summation. When control for abundance is projected, hoarding of more than just resources becomes an extreme aversion to scarcity. The most extreme case of this becomes prejudice. This is the pendulum paradigm or the parenting paradigm, so that our parents step in and they parent us with this pendulum paradigm. Oh, my mother was a perfectionist. I'm going to be a slob. Oh, my mother was a slob. I'm going to be a perfectionist. That's exactly what's going on here. This is what happened to me. So my mother's mother was a narcissist with extreme hoarding issues. My mother was an empath with extreme perfectionism issues. I am borderline. I was borderline personality disorder with a toggle between hoarding sometimes and anxious hoarding, while I also did avoidant behavior at the same time. I did both. That's called disorganized attachment style because I was borderline. Because my mother did basically binge purge parenting, where she swung both extremes all the time. And when you are swinging both extremes, you are not centered in the middle with a balance of harmony. Harmonized parenting is where everyone needs to be. Harmonized living is where everyone needs to be. This is when you are no longer racist, prejudiced, or an extreme. This is no longer black and white. This is no longer either or polarized thinking. You are thinking on a spectrum. When you think on a spectrum, you also learn to integrate both extremes into a harmonious existence. In order to do that, you have to abandon all bias and prejudice. And in order to do that, you have to overcome trauma. In addition to pendulum paradigm parenting, you also mimic and repeat the parenting you were exposed to. So there's a good chance you are repeating the words used by your parents while also going the extreme aversion to what your parents did to you, creating your own version and cocktail of absent-minded parenting. Now you have children and you are now implementing the extreme onto your child while also mimicking and repeating the same garbage that your parents told you. So that by the time you have a 2 to 4-year-old, the child has already picked up on narcissistic, empathic, imbalanced behaviors, and you already have a young narcissist at work. So parental diagnosis is basically stepping in and say, diagnose the child, assess based off of the child's behavior what kind of parenting the child was already getting. As soon as you have that information, you can now address to the parents, okay, this is what you're parenting with. This is where you are on the pendulum, and this is where you are with mimic and repetition. Boom, there you go. The parents now have the option to basically go through the therapy that they need to correct this and make sure that they are doing balanced, harmonious parenting without the bias, and they abandon the absent-minded mimicry and they start being mindful about the kind of parenting they're giving their children. That should correct the problem. So if this is something that interests you, go ahead, click on the link below, click on Change Now, contact me. If you love shit like this, like, subscribe, follow, comment below, let me know what part of the show resonated with you. Thank you so much, and may the kindest of words always find you.